So it's 7:02. I figured I don't have a joke to, especially not one to top that. But I figured this is Faith Academy, right? Isn't that what we're calling the class? So what comes with the academy? Yeah, the student says test. So I figured I start with a test, right? So this is going to be a 5-minute test, and if you don't pass it, you don't get the diploma. So be sure that you try and pass it. So I got 7 questions up there. What you're going to do is talk to whoever's next to you for the next 5 minutes. At 7:08, I'm going to stop you. Can you guys read that? Is it too small? Hopefully you can read that. Talk with the guy or gal or whoever's sitting next to you if you need to turn around or whatever. Answer those questions. Ready, set, go. You got 5 minutes. You guys that are individuals, you can join somebody. Feel free to move around. It's fine. Nobody bites here. David, join some of these singles. Yeah. Number 2, it's supposed to be of. There's probably lots of mistakes because I just did it real quick. Why does Belshazzar offer the third position in the kingdom to whoever can read the writing on the wall? This is a quiz. If you want to, Bob, we're quizzing each other. So if you want to find somebody, you can find somebody if you'd like. All right. Got it? This stuff out. Offense. 3 more minutes. 3-minute warning. Oh, I forgot to mention it's not open note. It's not open note. Okay, it's okay. Your dog ate your homework? I'm going to add another. How many mistakes did you find just in this little thing that I wrote? I've seen like 4 or 5. Sorry. I just literally typed it up real quick. Number 4 is, in what ways did the Jews prosper? One more minute, 1-minute warning. Gotta go quick. Thirty seconds. Those of you who just came in, you got 30 seconds left. All right, that's it. It just struck 708. Let's go over this real quick. Who exiled Judah and when? What years? Just shout it out. Nebuchadnezzar. What years? Good. Remember, there's three waves: 605, 597, 586. Extra credit. Who was Nebuchadnezzar's father? Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, we'll give you half a credit for that, half point for that. Why does Belshazzar offer the third position in the kingdom to whoever can or whomever can read the writing on the wall? Daniel 5:7. Right, because he's second. Who was the first? Who was the one who was first in command? Okay, what was his name? Nabonidus. Good. Yes, Nabonidus. Discuss how Cyrus's decree differed from Assyrian and Babylonian foreign policy and what effect it had on the Jews in exile. Yeah, the carrot versus the stick, right? Remember that? So Assyrians and Babylonians, they used the whack method, and the Persians, thank you, they used the hug method, right? And so Cyrus, remember, made a decree everybody can go back, and the Jews, how did it affect the Jews? Let them go back. And they brought back the vessels with them that Nebuchadnezzar had exiled. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. In what ways did the Jews prosper in Babylon through the centuries? From the back, maybe the back row Baptists. Anybody? Okay, money and influence. Half of a point for that. Expand a little bit. Yeah, okay, we'll take that. Yeah, they engaged in commerce. Can you give like some more specific examples? And you're making it harder than it should be, I think. If you just think, I'll give you a hint, Bible. Well, that's not Bible, but so like later on in the Middle Ages, or just before the Middle Ages, they produced the Talmud, right, in the 5th century or so AD. But what were you? Yeah, they took lots of stuff. Remember Ezra chapter 2, it talks about, 1 and 2 actually talks about all of the gold and the silver and plates and everything they bring back with them. But even more obvious than that, think more obvious than that. Broaden your thinking for a second. Yeah, I don't know if that has to do with prospering, but you're right. They picked up some of the language. Starts with S and ends with ter. Remember, you could actually become queen in exile. I mean, that's an example of the fact that not every single Jew was just shunned, right? I mean, Esther actually became queen. You're right. It's part of influence. But even Esther rises to the really kind of second in command there in the kingdom. And we could probably give more examples, but that's good. What are two elements of Hellenism that we see traces of in our culture today, even here in Boise? Okay, the emphasis on sort of philosophy and like thinking like rationally, yeah? What's that? Order, yeah, exactly. Contrary to what we might think, but Boise's actually pretty orderly compared to other countries. Entertainment, okay. Like what kind of entertainment? Sports, right? That's a huge part of well, you could also go the other way. Hollywood, right? The theater. We're going to say something, David? Sports, yeah. Good of society, yeah. Whatever is right for the whole or for the most, that's what's right. That's what's moral. I mean, that's kind of like a stream in Greek thinking, which I don't know if that exactly matches with what God says, right? Anything else? Okay, I don't know that we're speaking Greek, but we're speaking a language that is related to Greek. Yeah, so I think we see traces of that in our language. Certainly English is closer to Greek than it is to Hebrew, right? I mean, the first two letters of the alphabet. Well, same in Hebrew, but we won't expound on that. But you're right. The language is closer to Greek than it is to sort of the Eastern languages. Name the two key generals who succeeded Alexander the Great? Ptolemy, who was ruling where? Egypt, good. And not Titus, Seleucus, right? And that's who eventually became the Seleucids, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And that will bring us to the next slide here. But remember, their Seleucids are up there in sort of Antioch, Asia Minor. Antioch was their capital, and then the Ptolemies down there in Egypt, and they became many kingdoms that were rivals. And say everything you know about the LXX. Just give me popcorn answers. Greek Old Testament, translated in Egypt. Somebody said that. Was that you? Okay. What else? 72 people. 6 from each tribe. When was it translated about? Yeah, mid-3rd century, okay? 250, started with the Pentateuch, and then eventually the rest of the Old Testament was translated. Anything else? Yeah, it's the Christians that preserved it, that copied it down, and really it's because of Christian scribes that we have it today. Anything else? Yep, exactly. At that point, not nobody, but most people are not speaking Aramaic. They're mostly speaking Greek, which is why they translate it in Egypt into Greek. Right? It's like Egypt, shouldn't they be writing hieroglyphs? No, they're speaking the lingua franca. Greek is what becomes the language of commerce, and so they translate the Old Testament. And then eventually the New Testament is written in Greek because it's still the main language of the day. Anything else? All right, anybody get them all right? David said he got them all right. Almost. Good. We're going to have it all stand up, and whoever got the least amount, no, I'm just kidding. Good. So that's just a little bit of a review. Moving on to where we left off. Any questions, by the way, of anything we've covered so far? David? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I can do that without getting into the weeds. I mean, there are a few occasions where there's like a word or two that's missing in the Hebrew text, and it's preserved in the Greek text. So, for example, in 1 Kings chapter 13, it says Saul was blank years old when he became king, and it has the word 1 in there, and then it says after 2 years he died. So, like, if you just read the Hebrew, it looks like the author is saying Saul was 1 year old when he became king, and when he had reigned 2 years, he died. So he died when he was 3, after reigning 2 years. Probably not the right text. Right? There's probably a word or a number, I should say, is missing there. The Septuagint has the number 40 in there, and so that preserves what I think is more accurate. When he had reigned 40 and 2 years, so 42 years, he died. So there's examples like that where the Septuagint seems to preserve the more original text. And as I said, I think the analogy to think of is, think of in which hand is the gold coin. It's not that the text has been lost. I mean, I think we can confidently read the Bible and know that we're reading what God wants us to read. I don't think what we should do is say that there's absolutely no mistakes in any manuscript. Because there's not. That's not the case. I mean, you just try and copy one page from, look at how many mistakes I made just in writing that. Right? So, I mean, you just try and copy something, you're going to make mistakes. Now, probably not the best example here, because the scribes had rules that they followed like stringently, so that, they actually counted the number of letters, and then they got to the middle of the book, and they wrote what the middle letter was in the book, and then they got to the end of the book, and they wrote how many words are in the book. And you can see that even in our manuscripts today, in what's called the Masoretic text, you see that recorded. So they had very strict rules that they followed, but still, is that thunder? Wow. Still, they made mistakes, right? And so what textual critics do is they look at all the manuscripts and they say, okay, how do we come back to or as close as we can to what the original is? And there's another example that comes to mind is in Genesis chapter 4. It talks about Cain and Abel, and it says that Cain was very angry, Genesis chapter 4, verse 5, and his face fell, and the Lord said, "Why is your face fallen?" Verse 8, Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and then in the Hebrew it continues, it says, "And when they were in the field, Cain rose up and against his brother Abel and killed him." Well, in the Hebrew, it doesn't say that Cain actually goes out into the field. It just says Cain spoke to his brother Abel. In the Greek, it says, and then he went into the field, and then it continues, and then it says, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So I think that'd be another example of how the Septuagint seems to preserve a bit of information that helps to clarify what actually happened. Now, I think sometimes it's inaccurate. It's not always accurate. So just another example would be in the Hebrew text in 1 Samuel chapter 17. How tall is Goliath? We all know how tall he is. He's 9 feet tall. In the Septuagint, they shrink him down. He's smaller than I am. He's 6 feet tall. So maybe, but maybe not. I don't know, right? I mean, he was tall, and everybody else was 4 feet tall. And maybe the Septuagint is correct. I kind of have my doubts, but it's just a matter of looking at all the text and trying to see which one is preserving the correct reading. Hopefully that answers it enough for now. Yeah. So again, I think we're straying a little bit from the class, but let me address it because it's important. The Bible is the foundation of our faith, and so I don't want to say that there's nothing, that we don't have certainty in our scriptures, right? We do, and I think Protestant Reformation, we can stand on the shoulders of, Martin Luther and John Calvin and say, yes, we believe that the Bible is the authority because we can trust it. We can trust that it's been recorded accurately. Having said that, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, the earliest complete codex, so the earliest complete Bible that we had of the Old Testament was from 1009 AD. It's a codex called Codex Leningradensis from Leningrad. So it's 1,000 years old. 1947, they find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, well, they date, and there's a range of dates for them, but the earliest from about 250 BC. So the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 went back about 1,200 years earlier than the earliest manuscripts that we had in 1946, just before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So in that sense, I know I'm not getting to the Septuagint yet, but in that sense, we do have old Hebrew manuscripts. We don't have all of the Bible preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, we have all of the books represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for the book of Esther, but not all of the books of all of the manuscripts, if that makes sense. So we do have old Hebrew texts. Back to the Septuagint question, though, the Septuagint preserves what the tradition that was started in 250 BC. Now, the oldest Septuagint manuscripts that we have don't go back to 250 BC, but they're part of that stream of tradition that was started then, if that makes sense. So some of the earliest Septuagint, I don't know offhand, but some of the earliest Septuagint manuscripts are from probably like just a few, like probably Origen's time, so like maybe like 3rd century AD. Well, I don't want to get too into the weeds there, but so the answer is yes and no. In the Septuagint, we have a preservation of an old tradition, but the manuscripts themselves don't go back as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are older than what the complete codex was prior to their discovery in 1947. Does that make sense? All right, good questions. Let's get back to Alexander the Great. And this is where we left off last time, basically. Remember that Alexander the Great sweeps through the Middle East, and he conquers all of the known world, all the way over to India in a matter of 10 years. Okay, so he comes to the throne he's 20 years old, 333 BC, and he dies basically 10 years later when he's about 30. Actually, it's about 13 years later. That's where we left off, and then actually, we made a little bit farther than that. When he dies, his kingdom's divided up among his two generals, like you guys said, the Seleucid or Seleucus, as he's known there, and the Ptolemies. And these guys form many kingdoms that fight against each other for the next 200 years or so. And that's from about 300 to about 63 BC, which is when Rome enters into the picture in a more significant way. And we'll get to that here in just a second. So those are the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And remember, I mentioned in Daniel chapter 11, that whole chapter describes these wars that ensued between the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south, as Daniel calls it there in Daniel chapter 11. And for the first, and I showed you this slide last week, and I think we finished with this. For the first 100 years, the Ptolemies control the land of Israel. So that's from 300 BC to 199. And you can see there, we don't have very much information about what life was like for the Jews there. Remember, I gave you kind of two events. One of them talks about a prominent Jewish family called the Tobiad family that lived here in the land of Israel. And so there's sort of this feud that goes on between this family that is really divided politically. Luckily, we don't have any kind of those issues today, right? Divided politically. And the high priestly family was sort of against the Ptolemies, whereas the Tobiads were more pro-Ptolemy, pro-Egyptian. That's about all the information that we have about what's going on in the land of Israel. But then outside of the land of Israel, we have the translation of the Septuagint down in Egypt, as we just reviewed, so I won't go into that. Now, a big battle occurs in 199, and that is in a city called Banyas, which is up in the north of Israel, right up here. In the modern Golan Heights of today, if you can envision it, it's just on the border with Syria. And one of these Seleucids, a guy called Antiochus III, not the same Antiochus that we're going to talk about in a second. Antiochus Epiphanes is a different guy, but this is Antiochus III. He fights against Ptolemy IV, and he successfully pushes the Ptolemies back down into Egypt, and for the rest of that 100-year period of time or so, 130 years, the Seleucids control the land of Israel. So that happens at the Battle of Banyas, and that coincides with the rise of another player in the region, okay, the rise of Rome. It's really raining out, isn't it? Is it always this loud when it rains? I don't know. It feels really noisy. I can even hear myself thinking. So I like to think of it like in the distance, sort of beyond the horizon, you can hear the drum, the war drum of the Romans, sort of gaining steam, kind of in the background. And that's when Rome actually succeeds right around that time. Okay, so there's like a 1 or 2 year difference between when the Seleucids push back the Ptolemies and the rise of Rome in the west. They defeat Philip of Macedonia. Not the same Philip, obviously of Alexander the Great, but another Philip. And so they push the Greeks out of Roman territory off in the west. And in the Isthmian, not sure I was supposed to say that, Isthmian Games, in 196, Rome declares freedom from the Hellenes. Okay, so Rome has pushed Greece back. They've kind of put them a little bit on the defensive out in the west. And that's really, from then on, the Romans will just continue to rise in power and push the Greeks back. So the meaning of that, obviously, is the rise of Roman imperialism, the decline of Hellenistic rulers in Rome, and eventually Rome is going to totally push the Greeks back and conquer the entire known world. But we're not going to focus on that because we're focusing on the land of Israel here. After this guy, Antiochus III, another guy called Antiochus comes onto the scene. And I think there's 9 of these guys called Antiochus, so they like the same name. Just like How many George Bushes were there, right? Same. So you have Antiochus the Fourth, and he is a very key player in Jewish history because he becomes sort of like a second Haman. Okay, his name actually Epiphanes means God manifest, but his enemies switched it. Instead of calling Epiphanes, they called him Epimanes, which means madman. And he really did act sort of as a madman. And Josephus talks about him in Antiquities of the Jews, and he says that Antiochus attempted to make an end of Jerusalem and destroy the Jewish race. Very similar to what we saw back in the book of Esther, right? Let's do away with these people, and it's not the last time that somebody's going to try to do away with the Jewish race. It's something that you see frequently throughout Israel's history, throughout Jewish history. Now, right as Antiochus begins to rise in, remember he's a Seleucid, so he's up there in Antioch. As he begins to rise in power, down in Israel, there is something that's going on. There's some rivalry that is going on inside of the nation. And that's the beginning of the corruption of the priesthood. Very key event in Israel history, because this is the first time that we are going to see a Jewish person purchase the priesthood. Okay, and it comes about by a guy called Jason. So Onias III is the high priest, and his brother actually wants to be the high priest. So what he does is he travels over to Seleucid territory and sort of forms a bit of a relationship with him, a treaty, and he purchases the priesthood from Antiochus Epiphanes. And because the Seleucids, remember the Seleucids are controlling the land of Israel, they're the ones calling the shots as to who's going to be the leader. The religious leader is a really key figure. Because Judaism is such a part of life for Jews, right? If you can control the religion, you have very strong, very significant power in the life of the Jews. I made this chart here just so that you can see. Here, the high priests, all the way up until this point, were all descendants of the house of Aaron. Okay, so they're descendants of Levi. Not every Levite is a priest, and not every priest is a high priest, right? So it narrows down. So only those that are descendants of Eleazar, well, it kind of split. That's a whole other story too. But those who are descendants of Eleazar, who are descendants of Aaron, are allowed to be high priests. And then during the time of David, remember, organizes the priests. I know you can't see this, but that's fine. David organizes the priests, and there's actually 2 high priests in David's time. But there's 24 courses or 24 different priests that are, the whole, I should say it this way, the whole priestly community is divided up into 24 different courses, they're called, or orders, or groups. And they're all named after these individuals. Jehoiarib is one of them. Eliab is another one. In fact, just look at your Bible for a second. If you look at Luke chapter 1. Okay, if you look at Luke chapter 1, verse 5. In the days of Herod, and we're going to talk about Herod either today or next week, but this is Herod the Great, okay? Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. And then it says of the division of Abijah. Okay, so he is one of these 24 courses here. Abijah, I can't even read that. He is right there, I think. I think that says Abijah. Now, Jehoiarib is this guy here, and as we'll see, Josephus is a descendant of Jehoiarib. He's part of that lineage, who we writes of the history, but also these guys here, okay? These guys are also probably from Jehoiarib or from another one of these priests, okay? And let me come back to that in a little bit. So David divides them up into these 24 courses, but the high priest continues through this line. He's not one of these 24, that's why I put that arrow there. And you can see here the succession all the way down to Jehozadak, who goes to Babylon, and then I made another chart all the way down. And all these guys are still descendants of the house of Aaron until this guy here. Jason, he's the brother of Onias. And then there's going to be another guy, Alchemist, who is not even part of that family. Okay, so the corruption of the priesthood starts here. And you'll see that that develops on into the 1st century. By the time that you get to Jesus' time, there's no succession of high priests. It's not like, oh, my father was a high priest, so I am. How did they choose the high priest? Well, Herod the Great appointed the high priests, and then after he died, went by the wayside, whoever was ruling in Judea, the procurator or the prefect or the procurator, appointed the high priest. So in Jesus' day, remember there's Annas and there's Caiaphas. Those guys were appointed by the procurator, Pilate, in Jesus' day. And they're in the Old Testament, how long were the high priests for? High priests for? For life. In Jesus' day, it was just whenever the Roman prefect or procurator wanted to switch out the high priest. And so Annas was actually a high priest for quite a while. Caiaphas was quite a while too, but the previous high priests prior to Annas, there was 5 different high priests sort of every other year leading up to Annas. So they switched out a lot. And where does all this originate? Right here, okay, with the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, with the corruption of the priesthood. Now, at that point, Israel also begins to be Hellenized, okay? And so the Jews, they begin to adopt this Greek culture and this Greek thinking. And it really kind of takes, it comes in a few stages, I guess. First of all, Jerusalem is turned into a Greek city, or it's actually explicitly called a polis, okay? A Greek city which has, like, in order to be considered, like, think of today, in order to be called a capital city, you have to have a certain number of institutions in your city. Same kind of a thing. In order to be called a polis, in that day, you had to have Greek institutions, like a theater, frequently a decumanus, or, certain types of roads and other institutions. So Jerusalem officially becomes a polis, and if you look at the book of Second Maccabees, it actually is renamed Antioch. Now, Antioch, in our Christian mind, we think, oh, that's a good name, right? But Antioch was the capital of the Seleucid kingdom. So these are a Greek kingdom. So it's actually renamed after a Greek city. So it becomes Hellenized, and in part by Jason himself, who vies for the high priest and actually purchases the high priest from Antiochus Epiphanes. Here's what the author of Maccabees says. He says, when Seleucus died and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king at an interview 360 talents of silver and, from another source of revenue, 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it. So not only a gymnasium, but also provide the people to participate in the gymnasium. Time out for a second. In the Greek period, a lot of athletes would perform in the nude. So that's going to be offensive to Jews, where morality and, what's the word I'm looking for? Modesty, thank you, that's what I'm looking for. Modesty is a big thing. And so to perform in the nude, that would be not very, acceptable to some Jews. So he wants to build a gymnasium in his city, in Jerusalem, and provide a body of youth for it, and to enroll men of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. So now they're actually citizens of the Greek city that Jerusalem is sort of being turned into, and to enroll men as citizens of Antioch. And when the king assented and Jason came to office, he at once shifted the countrymen over to the Greek way of life. Okay, so he brings in Hellenism, and that's going to basically make more liberal the people of Jerusalem. So the guy who's claiming to be high priest does that, and then the king himself, Antiochus Epiphanes, also comes in, and he turns Israel and Jerusalem in particular into a sort of a Hellenistic city. And the way that this happens is, let me back up for a second. Remember the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were vying for power, fought against each other. So he has his sights set on Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Right? If you can take Egypt, you got all the grain that you want, a lot of riches coming out of Egypt. So he goes down into Egypt, invades Egypt, and nearly succeeds in taking Egypt. And actually he would have, had there not been another player in the region that steps in and tells him no. Anybody guess who that other player is? Rome. So Rome is actually just off of the map here, but they're aligned with Egypt. Rome says, hey, if I can align with Egypt, I get the grain of Egypt. Maybe we can then, successfully push back some of these Greeks, and then we can control the entire world. So Rome actually pushes Antiochus Epiphanes back. He says, you're not going to take Egypt. So Antiochus withdraws from Egypt, and on his way back, he attacks Jerusalem. And this is recorded here in Maccabees, and I wanted to just read a couple passages here because I think it's interesting to read the history firsthand. So he takes Jerusalem, and the year is 167 BC. Okay, so 160 some years before Jesus is born. And here's a couple lines from 2 Maccabees chapter 5. Verse 11, when the news of what had happened reached the king, he took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. So I don't want to go into the background here, but he thinks that Jerusalem is revolting. And so, raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by storm. He commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses. And then there was a massacre of young and old, destruction of boys, women, and children, and slaughter of young girls and infants. Within a total of 3 days, 80,000 were destroyed, 40,000 in hand-to-hand fighting, and as many were sold into slavery. So a lot of the Jews there were sold into slavery, and some were killed. Not content with this, Antiochus entered the most holy temple in all the world. Which temple is that? The temple in Jerusalem, where God lives. So he enters into the temple, guided by a guy called Menelaus, who actually became high priest at one point as well, who had become a traitor both to the laws and to his country. So he goes in, he destroys the city, and he enters into the temple, and this is what he does. Verse 16, he took the holy vessels with his polluted hands and swept away with profane hands the votive offerings that other kings had made to enhance the glory and honor of the place. I think the idea there is that some of the relics that, remember, Cyrus had given to the temple, those he destroys, along with the original vessels that were brought back from Persia to the city. Okay, so they're destroyed by Antiochus Epiphanes. So what that means is there's little hope of today of finding any remains from the first temple, because those, or at least those vessels from the first temple, were destroyed by this guy Antiochus Epiphanes. And what he does is he basically shuts down Judaism for 3 years. Okay? Doesn't allow the Jews to circumcise their men. Doesn't allow them to keep the Sabbath. Doesn't allow them to eat kosher food. Doesn't allow them to sacrifice to one God only. He says you have to sacrifice to the Greek gods. And doesn't allow pure worship in the temple. Basically, like I said, he forbids Jerusalem for a period of 3 years. Now, this is huge to the Jewish way of life. Even in exile, they still kept their Jewish identity. I mean, 70 years later, they came back and they still are Jews. They're still worshiping one God. So they were able to preserve their identity. If now a Greek guy comes along and he says, you guys now have to basically become Greeks, that's devastating to the nation of Israel. Let me read you a couple verses from 1 Maccabees now. Here's how 1 Maccabees describes it. He says, the king sent letters by the messengers to Jerusalem, and to the towns of Judah. And he directed them to follow the customs strange to the land. So they have to follow the custom of the Greeks. He forbid them to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the sanctuary. He made them profane the Sabbath and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols. So he makes them build idols to foreign deities in the temple, and to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals. So pigs, right? If there's not a more unclean animal in Jewish thinking than a pig. So here he comes in, he says, we're actually going to sacrifice a pig in the temple. And he commanded them to leave their sons uncircumcised, and they were to make themselves abominable in everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all of the ordinances. And he said, whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. So he actually succeeds in doing that. Okay, so Antiochus Epiphanes shuts down pure worship for 3 years, from 167 to 164 BC. So it's a very dark period in Israel's history, comparable to, I would say, probably the period of Manasseh. Okay, remember, in the Old Testament period, Manasseh is the longest ruling king, actually. He rules, I think, 55 years, or 52 maybe. But in any case, he actually does away with pure worship. Here's like a second Manasseh, Antiochus Epiphanes. And that sort of is going to lead the Jews to respond in a certain way. Now, not everybody's on board with how to respond to this. Like in every country, there's a spectrum of political positions. Some people just run away, and they say, well, let's just, flee, and if God wills, he'll bring us back. And you could maybe see the argument there. God's the one that brought the people of Israel out of Persia. They didn't have to do anything in order to come back. God, like it says in Ezra 1, and in 2 Chronicles 36, God stirred up the spirit in Cyrus to let the Jews go back. Some people just embraced Hellenism, and they said, let's just become Greek. Who cares? Why, this religion didn't do us any good. Look, it brought the Greeks in, so let's just embrace Hellenism. Other people said, no, we're going to refuse, even if it cost us our life. And you can read in the book of Maccabees, in 2 Maccabees, particularly in the first 5 chapters, there's story after story of Jews that were martyred for not submitting to the Greek way of life. And others took up the baton and said, let's liberate ourselves from the Greeks, let's fight back. And that's ultimately the position that won the day with a guy called Judas Maccabeus. Question? Or comment?
Remind us of what you said earlier about Daniel chapter 11, that just basically tells everything a couple hundred years ahead of time.
Totally.
Of Epiphanes. Like verse 31, it says, and the forces with him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress, do away with the regular sacrifice, set up the abomination of desolation, blah, 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 blah.
Totally.
Anyway, it was like, Daniel said it was prophesied, and guess what? It happened.
Yeah. No, I should have read that. You're right. That's. Thanks for bringing that up. A couple hundred years before it actually happens.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Time of Daniel.
Yeah. So that leads us to the Maccabean revolt. Okay, the time of what's called the Maccabees, and the revolt itself lasts about 30 years or so. I mean, it's hard to put an end to it exactly, but it starts with a guy called Mattathias, who has 5 sons that many of them, I think all but one, eventually become the leaders of the revolt. And then their sons pick up the baton and they become kings all the way up to the time of Herod the Great. Okay, so this is now the period from Antiochus Epiphanes, so 167 BC, on down to Jesus' day, okay, on down to the time of Herod the Great. That's known as the Maccabean period, the period of the Maccabees. It's also known as the Hasmonean period, and I'll mention that in just a second here. So it starts with Mattathias and his son Judas. Now I put this picture here of this flower just because, one, it's a really pretty flower, but in Hebrew it's called Dam HaMaccabim. It's called the blood of the Maccabees. So it's kind of a cool flower that you see all over Israel. And it kind of is a reminder, I think, of the fact that for Jewish history, this is a huge moment in their history. It's a very important period of time in their history because this is when the Jews finally gained independence from the Greeks. Okay, so they lost their independence, you could say, they lost their independence in 586, right, when Babylon destroyed the temple. They came back in 539, and they rebuilt the temple, but they're not an independent nation yet. They're still tipping their hat to the Persians, right? Artaxerxes, remember all of that in Ezra when they write a letter and they say they're rebuilding the walls, and he tells them to stop, and then they can build. But they're always just sort of really under the rule of Persia. And then the Greeks come in and they're controlling what happens, but it's under the time of the Maccabees that they actually gain independence. They have their own king. They're calling the shots with their high priest, with the rulers. So it's a really key period for Jewish history. What did I want to say here? The Greeks, when they came into the land, like any emperor, they don't have an interest in always fighting against the people of the land. What they want them to do ultimately is just be subservient and pay taxes, right? Pay taxes and give us peace, and we'll be happy. Everybody will get along. And so their policy was to force them to become Greeks, and then they'll be more apt to obey their way of living. So what Antiochus did is he turned to this guy Mattathias, who was sort of an important figure in Judaism, or in the people of Israel at that time. And he said, he turns to him, he says to him, "Do what the king commands." And Josephus talks about this in his account. He says, "Do what the king commands, and then you will be the king's friend, and you and your sons will be rewarded with silver and gold." So just do what we tell you to do. And one of the things that he wanted them to do is to sacrifice on a pagan altar in a city in Israel called Modi'in, near Jerusalem. Offer up a foreign sacrifice on a pagan altar outside of Jerusalem. And if you do that, then all of the people that respect you and look up to you will also do that, and then we'll all be happy Greeks together. So what Mattathias does is he says, "I'm not going to do that." And another Jewish guy gets up and he goes to offer a sacrifice on the pagan altar. Mattathias draws his sword, kills the Jewish guy, and then kills the Greek officer that was standing there as well. And that sparks a revolt, and the flames of that revolt spread throughout the entire country of Israel. And it's a revolt that lasts for a number of years called the Maccabean Revolt. So that's the response really that won the day. Mattathias advocated revolt. And just I brought in a passage here from Josephus. He says, "At this time there was a man living in the village of Modi'in in Judea named Mattathias, the son of Joannes, the son of Simeon, the son of Asmonias, a priest of the course of Joarib, and a native of Jerusalem who had 5 sons." Now just to focus on a couple things here. Number one, these Maccabees, are priests. Okay, so they're from the tribe of Levi. It's going to be important. They're from the tribe of Levi, they're priests, but they're not descendants of the high priestly line, right? The high priestly line has to go back through Aaron, but like what Josephus says here is that he's of the course of Joarib, those 24 courses of priests that were divided in David's time. So they're not high priests, but they're priests. And he's a native of Jerusalem. Okay, so we'll come back to that here in just a second. He starts the revolt. That's where Modi'in is. Here's Jerusalem, or is it right there? Okay, so it's just to the northwest of Jerusalem. And Josephus says that he's a descendant. Oh, let me back up for a second. He's a descendant of a guy called Asmoneus. Okay, so we don't know who this guy is. He must have been an important figure, but history doesn't give us indications of who exactly he is. But that's why scholars sometimes refer to this period as the Hasmonean period. Okay, they sometimes took on the name of a distant ancestor of theirs called Hasmonean, or Asmoneus, as Josephus calls him. Okay, so it's the Maccabean period or the Hasmonean period, same period. These are the Maccabees, the descendants of Mattathias. Okay, this guy here who is a native of Jerusalem, but living in this city called Modi'in. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm talking kind of fast, so slow me down if I'm going too fast. And so I already pointed this out. Okay, so he is a descendant of Joarib, right there. Okay, so he's one of those, he's a priest. And here is just a diagram of the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabean period. Mattathias is the father. He's got 5 sons. And all of these, except for John, he doesn't really play into the narrative, but all of these at one point become leaders of the revolt. Okay, so the first thing they do, after Mattathias sort of kills this Jewish guy and the Greek guy, they flee to the hills. That's their first approach, actually, is let's run away. We don't want to die by the hand of the Greeks. In Maccabees, it says Judas Maccabeus, with about 9 others, got away to the wilderness and kept himself and his companions alive in the mountains as wild animals do. And they continued to live on what grew wild, so that they might not share in the defilement. And that's the defilement of the Greeks. Okay, so we don't want to eat non-kosher food. We want to stay true Jews, so they go to the mountains, and they sort of live out there for a little while until they realize this is not a sustainable position. So they end up fighting against the Greeks. And it's really a David and Goliath story, because, I mean, the Greeks are way more powerful than the Jews are. But they decide not to fight on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, okay, on Saturday. And why is that? You're not supposed to work on Saturday, right? You're not supposed to work on Saturday, so we shouldn't fight. Here's what Josephus says. Sorry, this is Maccabees. Yeah. Says, they made this decision that day, let us fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Okay, sorry, let me back up for a second. Initially, they decide not to fight on the Sabbath day. But then they realize that if we continue not to fight on the Sabbath day, there's probably going to be a problem, right? The Greeks just realize, hey, on Saturday, they're all just sitting like this with their feet up and, sipping lemonade. Let's just try and take them on Saturday, and then we can kill everybody. So they decide, okay, initially, I didn't read that passage, but Josephus says that they initially decided not to fight on Shabbat, but then they made a decision that they should. If anyone fights against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath, let us not all die as our kindred did in their hiding places. Interestingly enough, though, not all agreed with this idea. Okay? In the book of Jubilees, don't get into the details here, but this is just another book from the Second Temple period. Here's what it says in this book. As for any man who does work on it, or goes on a journey, or who fasts, or makes war on the day of the Sabbath, let the one who does any of these die, so that the children of Israel might keep the Sabbath according to the commands of the Sabbath of the land. So some Jews said we shouldn't fight on the Sabbath. Other Jews said we should, because if we don't fight, then we're going to die. And what's more important, to save a life on the Sabbath or to die on the Sabbath? Here's another position. When Pompey stormed Jerusalem, he made a siege against it. But, Josephus says, if it were not our national custom to rest on the Sabbath day, Josephus says, the earthworks would not have been finished, because the Jews would have prevented this. For the law permits us to defend ourselves against those who begin a battle and strike us, but it does not allow us to fight against an enemy that does anything else. So you can fight a little bit, but there's some restrictions on Shabbat. And then I got one other verse here. This is later on. The Jews, seeing that war was now approaching the capital, they abandoned the Feast of Tabernacles and rushed to arms. And with complete confidence in their numbers, but without any organization, they leapt boisterously into the fray, utterly disregarding the seventh day's rest, although this was the Sabbath, which they usually observed most carefully. So when Titus came to Jerusalem, after Jesus' time in 70 AD, they did fight on the Sabbath day. Now, I highlight this because this is the point in Jewish history where this sort of an argument over what can and can't be done on the Sabbath day sort of arises among Jewish thinking. So for the Jews, Shabbat, or Saturday, is a sacred day, right? You don't work on Sabbath. That's one of if there's two things or three things maybe that distinguish Jews from anything else in the world. Number one is that they keep the Sabbath. Number two, it's that they circumcise their sons. And number three, it's that they worship one God. Okay, so it's such a key pillar of Judaism. But what do you do when there's a conflict that arises on Shabbat, on the Sabbath? Now, I have an interesting story to share about this. A few years ago, so probably 8 years ago now, I was leading a group of students around Israel, and we were doing an excavation. And there was another group that had joined our group, and we were all excavating, and it was a Friday afternoon. And we were excavating in a place, a very hot day, and so we usually finish excavating around 1 in the afternoon because we start excavating at like 5 in the morning when it's cool. So 1 o'clock comes around, we pack up all the tools, we bring them all down to the bus, and we all get on the bus, and we drive away. We're literally 2 minutes away from the excavation site, and somebody says, "Where's Sandy?" And I'm in the front of the bus, like, I don't know, anybody see Sandy? Like in the microphone. No, Sandy, she's not on the bus. So tell the bus driver, stop, let's turn around. We left Sandy back at the excavation site. Now, we were excavating in the West Bank, which was not a very safe place to excavate, but that's part of the concern too. It's very hot, you could have a heat stroke, and you might get blown up by a terrorist. So we turned around to try and to find Sandy. We walk around, nothing. I mean, she's nowhere to be found for like 45 minutes. I don't know where she is. So like, what do? There's literally 80 people on the bus, not 50 people on the bus. So I'm like, let's get back on the bus. She probably just took a taxi home after we left, thinking she missed the bus. So we drive back, and as we're going back, I'm like, let me just call like the equivalent to 911, see if somebody picked up a girl called Sandy. So I pick up the phone, call them. Did you guys pick up somebody called Sandy? In an ambulance? And they're like, well, we did pick somebody up. What did she look like? We didn't know her name. Like, I don't know, she had a purple hat on. They're like, yeah, we picked her up. She's in the hospital. We're like, wow. So we drive the bus home. I go over to the hospital. And long story short, she had a heat stroke. And what had happened, she was a little bit older lady. She was, I won't give an age so that you don't get offended by me calling her an older lady. But she had just had surgery and had liver problems, and the heat had really affected her. She had a heat stroke. So I go into the hospital room, and I see her shaking, and I'm like, she's gonna die. She definitely looked like she was gonna die. And I tell the nurse, I'm like, man, she doesn't look good. And the nurse says, no, she looks good. You should have seen her 2 hours ago. She was definitely gonna die then. She's getting better. So she ends up getting a little bit better and better and better. And all of a sudden, I get a phone call on my phone. There is going to be an end to this story. I know it got kind of long. But somebody called me on their phone. I'm like, hello, who is this? It's like an Israeli guy. He's like, hey, we found a backpack of a girl called Sandy, and it has your name on it. I guess my name was put down as a contact number. And this maybe has some information that you need. I'm like, we need that backpack because she had been taking a bunch of drugs for her medication, and the doctors needed to know which drug she's allergic to. So I'm like, bring the backpack now right away. And now it's when it gets to the point of the story. And the guy's like, we'll bring it to you, but there's a problem. I'm a Jewish guy, and it's almost Shabbat. It's Saturday. Saturday starts Friday night, so I can't drive. And I'm like, the girl's going to die. So I tell him, I said, listen, it's okay. In Jewish custom, there's something called pikuach nefesh. There's something called saving a soul. It's okay to break the Sabbath if you're saving a life. She's going to die. Bring us the backpack so that she doesn't die. And so he's like, we'll make a compromise. Let's, like any good Jew, right? Let's make a compromise. I'll meet you halfway. So I run out to my car. We drive there, and I meet him halfway. He gives me the backpack. He gets back home before Sabbath starts. I get the backpack. She gets better, and it's all a happy ending. So the point of that whole story, though, is that that's how important Sabbath is to Jewish people. They don't want to break it. But there is a debate. There are a number of things that you can do. You can break the Sabbath if in a certain number of occasions. And so I brought in a little list here that I thought would be interesting to just kind of read. Some things in Jewish law of today, you're allowed to do. You're allowed to break the Sabbath so long as it is for a benefit. So for example, somebody is allowed to travel in order to save another man's life. Or, on Sabbath, I should say. Or you're allowed to even accompany a woman who's going to the hospital to give birth on Sabbath, right? So if you are a husband, your wife's going into labor, you can also break the Sabbath day in order to give birth, because it's better to save a life than to take a life. Shabbat laws can also be bent for a woman who has given birth in the last 3 days to make sure that she is comfortable and healthy. So even if she gave birth on, say, Thursday, and then if she needs to do something on Sabbath, in order to make her healthy, you can break the Sabbath day. You can drive somebody to the hospital. If you're involved in a profession which is intended to save lives, such as a physician or an emergency medical technician, you can work on the Sabbath day because you're preserving a life, you're saving a life. You can extinguish a fire on Shabbat if you're saving a life. And you can even eat non-kosher food if it's specifically needed in order to cure an illness, which I thought that was an interesting one, since Jews are so concerned with eating kosher. So those are just a couple examples of when you can break the Sabbath day in today's Judaism, but this goes all the way back to the period of the Maccabees. Okay, so there was a debate. Can we fight on Sabbath or not in order to save ourselves? And you remember, this debate goes all the way down to the time of Jesus. And Jesus says, who wouldn't pick up their ox that falls in a hole on a Sabbath day? Isn't it better to save a life? And frequently, Jesus argued with the Jews of the day, because in their mind, if there's one thing that a Jew doesn't do, is he doesn't break the Sabbath. And yet Jesus transforms their mistaken understanding of the Sabbath, right? The point of the Sabbath is not, remember what Jesus says, the Sabbath is what? Made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Who's the slave of who? Is the Sabbath the slave of you, or are you the slave of the Sabbath? It's intended for your good. So it's a question that frequently was debated throughout Jewish history, and it really comes up right here during the time of the Maccabees. So the battle, or the revolt is initially successful. I'm not going to get into all the details. There's four key battles that are fought. 4 Greek commanders are defeated, one right after the other. Mattathias dies just 1 year into the revolt. So his son, Judas, takes over. His son succeeds him. And against all odds, the Jews throw off the Greek yoke in just 3 years. Okay, so in 167, Antiochus Epiphanes shuts down Judaism. In 164, they throw off the Greek yoke and they reinstitute Judaism, and they end up cleansing the temple. And I have this interesting little song here that I found that I'll play that illustrates what Hanukkah is, right? This is what Hanukkah is, and I'll talk about it here in just a second. I'll tell a tale, of Maccabees in Israel. Can you guys hear it? When the Greeks tried to sail, but it was all to no avail, yeah, the war went on and on and on, until the mighty Greeks were gone, yeah. Pay attention to what they're doing, what they're eating, and what they're talking about. Anybody ever seen that before? All right, so they're called the Maccabees. So this leads us to the cleansing of the temple and Hanukkah. Okay, now just a couple things here. First of all, Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't destroy the temple. Okay, he defiles the temple, so there's not a reconstruction of the temple after Judas takes over. That's why we're still talking about the Second Temple period. Okay, so the first temple, Solomon's temple, destroyed in 586, rebuilt under Zerubbabel finished in 516, and it stays until Titus destroys it in 70 AD. So it's still the Second Temple. It's a purification, not a construction. And they rededicate the altar and the gates, as you can read about in Maccabees. They rebuild new vessels too, as I mentioned, or as I note here. So remember, I read earlier, or I mentioned earlier, that Antiochus destroyed the original vessels that were brought back under Cyrus. So no hopes of finding vessels from the first temple, maybe from the second temple, but probably those are gone too. Probably Titus carried those away into Rome in 70 AD. Mount Zion is sort of refortified, so that's the cleansing of the temple. They clean it out. And they celebrate what's known as Hanukkah. And let me just give you a couple points here about Hanukkah. So first of all, the name Hanukkah, comes from the word to dedicate. It means dedicate. So if, like in Israel today, if you buy a house, let's say, and you want to have people over for a housewarming or something like that, you say, hey, come on over for Chanukkat Habayit. Come over for a Hanukkah of my house. It's a dedication, right? A celebration of my house, or of me buying a house. And what they do is they light a menorah. Okay, it's a 9-branched candelabra rather than a normal 7-branched menorah. There's one here that's called the the shamash, the servant. So you light him on the first day, then every night during those 8 days, you light sort of another candle. You light one, then that burns out, and then the next night you light 1 and 2, that burns out that night, then the next night 1, 2, 3, and so on through the 8 days. Okay, so it's an 8-day festival or a celebration that, like you saw in the video there, is in commemoration, according to Jewish tradition, and I'm going to get to this in a second, but according to Jewish tradition, celebrates a miracle that happened when Judas Maccabeus rededicated the temple. According to Jewish tradition, they came into the temple area and they found they needed oil to light the menorah in the temple, There's a special oil that you use. It's like a dedicated only for the temple. And they found only one can of oil, not a can, a jar of oil, but they needed to make more. So in order for the menorah not to go out, it's always supposed to be lit, they needed more oil. So miraculously, according to Jewish tradition, that they had enough oil for one day, but it burned for 8 days, miraculously. Okay, that's Jewish tradition. That's why you have 8 candles. And you also, did you see them spitting those, they're called dreidels, those little tops? That's not related to the Bible or anything, or to the sources, but on those square dreidels, those square tops that they spin, there's 4 letters on them. Nes Gadol Hayasham. This letter, that letter, that letter, and that letter, which means there was a big miracle there. And so it's kind of like a game. You spin it, whoever gets one of the letters, you win or something like that. Okay, so you spin the tops like at Hanukkah, and you also eat lots of any and everything related to oil. So that's why they're eating these sort of donuts. Remember the guy that ate that little pancake-looking thing? That's called a latkes, which is like a fried potato thing. Anything you make with oil is fine to eat, right? It's one of my favorite time of the year. So that's Jewish tradition. Okay, so it's called the Festival of Lights because of that. Now, the problem with tradition is there's oftentimes mistakes, but the whole festival is organized around this supposed miracle that happened. The problem is that let me go back here, this belief that this oil burned, that was enough for one day, burned for 8 days, it's only found in the Talmud, okay, which is a writing from much later. The Talmud was written in about anywhere between the 4th to the 6th centuries AD. So let's say 500 AD, because there's different ones, but let's just say round number, 500 AD. When does this happen again? You guys remember what year? 167 BC, okay, 164 BC. So what is that? 660 years later, you read in Jewish writings about this story, about the oil that burned for 8 days, whereas it should have burned for 1 day. It's possible that a tradition is preserved, that long. I mean, some of the Bible was written after the event happened. So the fact that it was written afterwards doesn't necessarily in and of itself mean it's not reliable. But if you look at what the sources that relate to this period say about this festival, it says nothing about oil. Okay, it doesn't say anything about the miracle of oil. If you look at 2 Maccabees chapter 10, let me read it for you here. This is written right around the time that this happened, just after. Okay, so let's be even conservative, 100 BC. So 60 years after the event of the cleansing of the temple. 2 Maccabees 10 says that this is what happened. Just listen here for a second. He says that this is the Jews, after they rededicated the temple, they celebrated the feast for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. So the explanation that the author of Maccabees gives for why they celebrated it for 8 days is they celebrated this festival in the manner that the Jews celebrated the festival that had just passed. And the festival that had just passed was the festival of booths. Let me translate that into our Gregorian calendar. Hanukkah usually is around the time of Christmas. The festival of booths is right now, actually. Just yesterday, I built a little sukkah in my house. Okay, this is a booth. My neighbor across the street came out, "What are you building over there?" I was like, how do I explain it to him? I said, "It's a sukkah." He's like, "What?" I was like, it's like the Jews. They celebrate. Remember in Leviticus chapter 23. In fact, let me read, if you want to just turn there. Leviticus 23 talks about there's 3 festivals that are what they call the pilgrimage festivals. 3 festivals where the men of Israel are supposed to appear in the place which God chooses. Passover, Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. And it says here in Leviticus chapter 23, I just read this with my kids yesterday, for 7 days you shall present food offerings at the Feast of Booths, and on the 8th day you should hold a holy convocation. Okay, so there's 8 days for the Festival of Booths. Now, if you go through the calendar, sometimes it's in September, sometimes it's in October because there's a different calendar, but if you go past October and you get to when this happened, you now get to December. What's the previous festival that had just happened? It's the Festival of Booths. And so Maccabees tells us that the reason that they celebrated it for 8 days is because that's the festival that just happened. They just rededicated the temple. So now let's celebrate the feasts like we're supposed to, like it says in Leviticus 23. So there's nothing that is said about the burning of the oil for 8 days. And Josephus says as much. Well, Josephus says something slightly different in book 12 of his Antiquities of the Jews. Let me just read it here. He calls it the Festival of Lights. So, menorah, light, there's a connection there. But the reason he calls it the Festival of Light is interesting. He says, we observe this festival, which we call the Festival of Lights, giving this name to it, I think, from the fact that the right to worship appeared to us at a time when we hardly dared hope for it. So Josephus has the opportunity to say why it's called the Festival of Lights, and he doesn't say because of the oil. He says because deliverance came like a lamp in the night, basically, right? It's darkness. Judaism was shut down for 3 years, and all of a sudden, we were somehow able to push back the Greeks and get our independence. And so that was like light in the night. So we call it the Feast of Lights. That's what Josephus says. And now moving into maybe a little bit more familiar territory, just look at John 10. Jesus is in the area of the temple. And what's the feast known as here in John? It's called the Feast of Dedication. Right, so at that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple, in the colonnade of Solomon. And they come up to him and say, how long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us. And what does Jesus say? I've already told you, but you don't believe me. And then he goes one step further, and he says, I and the Father are one. They want to stone him, and he slips away because by claiming that God is his Father, he's making himself equal with God. The Jews don't like that. Okay, so this festival is mentioned in the New Testament as well, but neither in the Maccabees, neither in Josephus, and neither in John do we have a reference to the oil or to this sort of miracle that occurred there, which is sort of a bummer because I like to eat donuts, right? And we all like to eat things that are oily, but I don't think you can make a historical case for that, okay, for doing that, but that's fine. Let the Jews continue on it. I don't care. But I like to highlight that because tradition and history don't always jive. They sometimes are in conflict with one another. So that is the festival of Hanukkah, and from 164 BC up until today, it's still celebrated. Any questions on that? Yeah. When you say beginning of Hanukkah, that's what Hanukkah is. Yeah, it's the Feast of Dedication.
So if we read dedication in the New Testament, we can connect that to
Yep. Hanukkah means dedication.
Okay, and it's completely separate from Feast of Booths.
It is. And the reason they celebrated it for 8 days is because the Feast of Booths had just passed 2 months earlier, but remember, they weren't delivered then. The temple wasn't cleansed, so they couldn't celebrate the Feast of Booths. In fact, during Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, you're supposed to offer like more sacrifices than any other feast. So they simply couldn't do that. There's a pig sitting on the altar. Any other questions? Okay, I'm just going to keep going here. The revolt continues. Remember, Judas has taken over for his father. I'm not going to get too into the weeds here, but just to kind of give you a quick overview, bring us down to Herod the Great eventually. Probably not today, next week though. Eleazar dies, and the only reason I mention him is because he dies in a cool way. So he's this guy here. Judas is the leader, but his brother dies, and his brother thinks that that Antiochus is on an elephant because they come in with elephants to fight. I mean, how cool is that? Like fighting on elephants. And so he slips under the elephant, stabs the elephant lands on him and kills him. So it's death by elephant crushing. I think it's just, I mean, maybe sad, but it's, how often do you get to die by an elephant? So that's Eleazar, and then Judas eventually dies 4 years later, and his brother Jonathan takes over. Let me go back here. Okay, so his brother Jonathan and Simon are both going to take over. First, Jonathan, and something significant happens during Jonathan's rule. He ends up ruling from 160 to 142, so how many years is that? 18 years. And then after him, Simon takes over. Okay, let me just go to that. Just after Jonathan becomes the ruler, the high priest dies. Okay, Alchemist, who's an illegitimate high priest to begin with. Remember, the high priesthood had been corrupted earlier. He dies, and he's an illegitimate high priest, and there's peace for 7 years. We don't really know, according to the history, we don't really know who's the high priest. Probably there is none. Probably there was 7 years without a high priest, is what seems to be the case. But then what happens is this guy says, you know, I don't only want to be king, I want to be high priest as well. And so you see the fusion between the ruler and the political ruler and the priestly ruler. So he takes on the high priesthood, and he's actually recognized by the Greeks that are not ruling the land, but still are, they know what's going on. He's recognized as the official king and high priest in the area. And that trend continues throughout the Maccabees, okay, throughout the Maccabean period. His son, I don't have to do this again, but just to remind you, remember, they're not descendants of Aaron. That's the line. They're from this guy, and it kind of goes off if you want to envision it that way. So all of the Maccabees after Jonathan become high priests, all the way down to Herod the Great. And eventually Simon takes over. He does the same thing, and they reach sort of a new level of independence. They're able to mint coins with their names on them, and they're calling themselves kings. So they're actually like legitimate kings in the eyes of the Greeks. So just to summarize the Hasmonean revolt, or the Maccabean revolt, however you want to call it, Rome is now a major player in the region, but we haven't talked about them because they're still off in the distance. But remember, they're the ones that sort of instigated Antiochus Epiphanes' destruction of the temple. Not destruction, plundering, that's not even the right word either. Desecration of the temple. Okay, remember, Rome had sided with Egypt, and Antiochus is angry about that, and so he desecrates the temple in Jerusalem in 167. Jews at that point successfully gain independence. Now I put quotes around independence because they're still a mice. They're still a mouse. They're not cats. Okay, Greece is still the big cat. They're the mice, but they're mice that are big enough to be able to fight against themselves. They can fight, with Moab or with the Idumeans or whoever. So Greece is still kind of keeping an eye on what's happening in the land of Israel, but they're legitimate kings. They're actually ruling themselves. The temple's refurbished at that point. Okay, that's 164 BC. That's when Hanukkah is instituted or begins. That festival begins. The high priesthood is corrupted by now. So the question is, are the Maccabees good, either for Judaism or for the country? And the answer to that really is going to be, well, it depends on your political persuasion, right? If you are for siding with the Greeks, then no. If you're against the Greek, then yes. But maybe if we can Christianize that, are they saved? Right? Are they good guys? I just before I came here, I just watched another little clip of just to kind of refresh my mind of what Jews think about Hanukkah. And for them, Hanukkah it's a huge holiday. I mean, it's a major thing, and the video that I watched said that they describe it as, in part, like the soul of Judaism, because they're gaining independence, they're ruling over themselves, and there's this miracle that happens. Because here's their thinking. How does Hanukkah come about? It comes about by not sacrificing pigs to foreign gods, so they're obeying God, and God gives them the deliverance, and then there's a miracle. For 8 days, the oil burns. So in Jewish thinking, they're thinking this is like God's hand leading, the Jews to prosperity. And I think it's, as a Christian, I just don't feel the same connection that they do to Hanukkah, right? First of all, I don't want to be about Judaism. I want to be about Jesus. And I don't want people to see a religion. I want people to see a faith in a living Lord and Savior, right? That's what I want. But the other thing that I was thinking about is, how would we assess whether or not they're good people, whether or not they're, quote, saved? Well, let's look at their actions. And how do they act? Well, they corrupt the high priesthood. They take it upon themselves. And you see that passed on throughout their reign. They're very violent. I mean, when it comes down to it, they are revolting against the Greek overlords. And I was just trying to think, what does the Bible have to say about, political revolutions? And I know it's a sensitive issue probably for Christians today, because especially in just this politically divided, country that we live in. But I just thought of Romans 13, right? And what does Paul say in Romans 13? Do away with the emperor and set up your own kingdom, right? I mean, he doesn't say that. He says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and that those that exist have been instituted by God. I mean, obviously this is written after the time of the Maccabees, but I mean, God's word, I think, holds true in any period. So I don't know, I was just struggling to think what should be our approach to sort of the overthrow of governments. And it seems like Paul is saying to be submissive to the government. And you let God bring about the deliverance. I mean, he did that. He did it without anybody having to shoot an arrow in the time of Cyrus. They came back, right? He stirred up Cyrus's spirit and they came back. So I think that, along with their corruption, I don't see them in a sort of a positive light. I don't have a specific verses that I can say they broke the law here and they broke the law there, because they're zealous for the law, actually. They're trying to obey God, but it seems like maybe they go a little bit too far. So those are just kind of my thoughts. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well. Yeah, any questions or thoughts? Yeah, David. Right.
And then you get a couple generations removed, the conviction's gone. And
Yeah.
like, I would say one of the questions would be, is Hanukkah more important than Passover?
Totally.
And if it is, if you go, that could be a problem. If we celebrate the 4th of July more excited than resurrection, right? That's probably a little bit dangerous. But maybe there's both that could be good. You might find people that are really well-meaning on both sides of that issue. But it seems like a lot of those things, they start off for all the right reasons. But man, give me some time and leaven gets in there.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, great comments. I mean, you could even extend it even more. Is Passover more important than Christmas? I mean, one of the things that I don't want you guys to think that I'm like trying to push Judaism. I think it's interesting to talk about the history, but like again, for me, being a Christian, that's what's important, right? We want people to see Jesus, and they want people to see Judaism. But one of the things I remember in Israel that sort of rubbed me the wrong way is Christians sometimes would celebrate Hanukkah, which I'm fine with. I'm fine eating greasy food, like I said earlier. But then they'd be like, well, we don't want to celebrate Christmas because we don't know when Jesus was born. Christmas maybe was born out of a pagan holiday. And, and so then they just leave it at that. Like, we can celebrate Christmas whenever. I'm like, well, true, but you can also celebrate Hanukkah whenever, but you're celebrating it on a certain day. And what's more important? Why not pick a day, right, and celebrate the birth and the resurrection of Jesus? Just because they're like, that's a Christian thing that's been abused over the centuries, and it's connected to presents and gifts, and I get that. But if you go to the true meaning of Christmas, which is more important, Hanukkah or Christmas? So, I mean, I think it ties in with what you're saying. Maybe it starts off with good intentions, this revolt, and then as time goes on, I think when we look at the Hasmoneans in more detail, you can see that some of them were certainly bad guys. I mean, Alexander Jannaeus, bad guy, and everybody hated him for it, but he killed a lot of people. So he's a bad guy. I have 10 more minutes. You guys okay with me going on for 10 more minutes? I think we're supposed to end at 8:45. Let me keep going. If you guys need to leave, that's fine too, but I think I was told 8:45. Backtrack for just a second, and you guys all know about the Samaritans, right? So in the New Testament, we're all familiar with the woman at the well, John chapter 4. Who are the Samaritans? Where do they come about? And that's what I want to just touch on here briefly. If you look at 2 Kings chapter 17, we have reference to people that live in the area of Samaria. Okay, so the word Samaritan actually really relates to the word Samaria, which is a region. Okay, the region of Samaria, so they're called Samaritans. Or Shomronim, as it's referred to in Hebrew. 2 Kings 17, verse 24. Now, we didn't cover this in the class, but this is before Babylon. Remember, the Assyrians carry off the northern kingdom of Israel into exile in 722 BC. What happened at that time? Same thing that happened in the Babylonian period later. The Assyrians take off the northern kingdom into exile, and then they bring other people into that land and resettle them there. They shuffle the people around, okay, in order to get them to not revolt against them. And we read about that here in verse 24 of 2 Kings 17. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, from Cutha, Ava, Hamat, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. So you have people living up there, foreigners living in the region of Samaria. That's the northern kingdom of Israel, so north of Jerusalem. I should put a map up here, but it's north of Jerusalem all the way up to Galilee and beyond, actually. Okay, so they're known as the Samaritans. But look at what these Samaritans, people living in Samaria, were like. Verse 29 says that every nation that the king of Assyria brought into the land still made gods of its own, and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities in which they lived. So the foreigners that came in and resettled in that northern area of Samaria, the Samaritans, if you will, were still polytheistic, right? They're still offering gods to their gods that they originally offered to in their home country. And then you have kind of another reference to people living in that area in Ezra chapter 4. Ezra 4, remember, I briefly mentioned this, but when they begin to build the temple, the people who are in the land, they say, hey, we want to join you. And Ezra 4 verse 2 says that, let us build with you, the people who are there, for we worship your God as you do, as we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here. Okay, so there's another reference to these people group, to these foreigners who were living in the land of Israel, sort of sacrificing to the God of Israel, but also to their own God. So they're in the Old Testament, they're polytheistic. They're syncretistic, right? Meaning they bring the foreign gods into worship with the true God. When we get to the New Testament, though, you have sort of a different picture of who the Samaritans are. Just think of John chapter 4. Remember the woman at the well? Jesus goes to Sychar, and what does she say? She says, well, let me read it. John 4, verse 11, let's say. Jesus engages with the woman at the well there, and she says, or he says, I would have given you living water if you would have asked of me. And she says, where are you going to get living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? Now, interesting, she says, our father Jacob. So the Samaritans in the New Testament period identified themselves with the nation of Israel. They said, we share the same father. And then there's this discussion about where to worship. And she says, verse 20, our fathers, again, talking about the Samaritans now. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place that we ought to worship. So the point is that by the time of the New Testament, the Samaritans are monotheistic. Okay, they're only worshiping one God, and they seem to have identified themselves with the people of Israel. Right? They share a common ancestry, at least in their mind and their thinking. So what happened? How do you bridge the gap between what's in the Old Testament and the New Testament? Josephus helps to fill in some of the details. And here it gets, just hang with me for a second, it gets a little bit complicated, not too much, but a little bit complicated. He talks about a story, and time out, he puts it in the wrong context. He says it happened during the time of Alexander the Great, but it actually happened during the time of Nehemiah. So 500 BC, okay? So 500 BC, just before Nehemiah, 50 years or so, he talks about a story. He says that the high priest at the time was a guy called Jaddua, and his brother was a guy called Manasseh. Now, his brother had married a foreigner called Nikaso, okay? And the elders of Israel, they came to the high priest and they said, hey, your brother is not a good example for the nation. He's married a foreigner. You're not supposed to intermarry with the foreigners. Tell your brother to divorce his wife so that the nation will be clean, will be pure. Sound like anything that they dealt with in Nehemiah's time? Intermarriage, right? The same thing. And so what does Manasseh do? Does he divorce his wife? He actually doesn't. He goes to his father-in-law, who's called Sanballat. Ever heard of that name before? We also know from the book of Nehemiah. And he says, listen, I actually really like your daughter, and we're married, but I also like being a priest. I like that my brother's a high priest. I kind of like the spiritual influence that I have on the people. And so what his father, Sanballat, says is he says, tell you what, I'll make you a deal. You come with me, stay married to my daughter, and I will give you the funds to build your own temple, and then you can be your own high priest. And so that's what happens. He ends up going to the northern part of Israel in Mount Gerizim, builds a temple there. He becomes high priest, and then Josephus says this. He says, many Jews came with him up there. So that, if you reconstruct the history, it happens around the time of Nehemiah. It's hard to get the dating exactly right, to be honest. But around the time of Nehemiah, let's say about 500 BC. Now, in excavations on that mountain there, northern Israel, they found a temple from that time, actually, a Samaritan temple. So at that time, who was living up there? Well, you had, first of all, the people who Esarhaddon had brought in, the king of Assyria, and earlier before him, I don't want to confuse you with names, but Shalmaneser V, okay, this Assyrian king. You had foreign peoples that were brought into the nation. Remember, we read about them in 2 Kings 17. So you have foreigners living up there, but you also have Jews that go with Manasseh up there, and sort of this group of both foreigners and Jewish people, renegade Jews you might call them, they sort of establish their own religion, and they start a temple, and they start offering sacrifices there, and they come to be known as the Samaritans. Okay, so that by the time you get down to Jesus' day, they're identifying themselves with the nation of Israel. They are worshiping one God. And if you were to look at their DNA, I just make up this number, but 80% of them have Jewish blood running in their veins, and 20% of them have foreign blood running in their veins. Okay, because they're part of those foreigners that the Assyrians had brought in. Those are the Samaritans of Jesus' day. And let me just quickly mention this because we're out of time. But their beliefs were similar to Judaism. Okay, they believe in one God, believe in the law of Moses. Now, they only believe in the first 5 books of Moses. Okay, they only believe in the Pentateuch. And the reason is that they think that Mount Gerizim is the central place of worship, where you should build a temple, where you should sacrifice to God. Whereas the Jews, where do they believe that the central place of worship is? In Jerusalem, which is why in John 4, there's that discussion between Jesus and the Samaritan. Now, it makes sense that the Samaritans are going to reject the rest of the Old Testament, because how many times is Jerusalem mentioned in the Pentateuch? 0. It's never mentioned. And it doesn't even say what the central place of worship is. There's a lot more I'd like to say about that, because that's a fascinating topic. But it hints to where it could be, and actually the central place of worship moves around. But what does the rest of the Old Testament say? It says Jerusalem is the central place of worship. David builds the temple, or wants to build a temple there. Solomon builds a temple there, and the rest of the prophets talk about Jerusalem. So it's very much in their best interest to reject the rest of the Old Testament. So Samaritans believe only in the Pentateuch. They believe that they're the chosen people. They have a connection to the land of Israel. There's some differences, obviously. Difference in sanctuary, difference in priesthood. They obviously, they're going to trace eventually their line back up to this guy Manasseh. And they have some different holy books as well, which I won't go into. Here's a picture of Samaria today. There are about 800 Samaritans that live in Israel. I'd say about a quarter of them live on Mount Gerizim, where this is the high priest here, where there's no longer a temple there, but about a quarter of them live on Mount Gerizim, and then about 3/4 of them live kind of near Tel Aviv. And they speak Hebrew. They basically are Israelis, those that live in Tel Aviv area. Some of them are more connected to the Palestinians, but they claim to be descendants of the Samaritans. And every year they have a Passover sacrifice on Mount Gerizim. Still today, I've been there a bunch of times. They slaughter a lamb. There's kind of a public event. Back to this picture, you can see here's the spectators. And they slaughter, a lamb on their Passover day. And so their tradition goes all the way back to, or they claim to go all the way back to whenever the Samaritans began. Historically, I think you can trace that back to the time of Nehemiah. But now, obviously, they're not going to say that. They're going to say we're the true remnant of Israel, because they think that they are preserving the correct form of worship. And I remember one time actually at the Samaritan Passover hearing a discussion between a Samaritan and an Israeli, and they were arguing about where the central place of worship is, and I just thought it was an interesting discussion. They have their own Pentateuch, and in their own Pentateuch, there's some differences. One key difference is that it actually says where the central place of worship is. That is alluded to numerous times in the book of Deuteronomy or in Exodus. So here's an example from Exodus. It says, you bring your sacrifice and your offerings to the Lord, and you sacrifice peace offerings. You eat there, and you rejoice before the face of the Lord your God. The mountain, I probably mistake, there is across the Jordan, behind the way of the rising sun, in the land of Canaan. Remember, it's Moses who's on the other side, and who is dwelling in the desert before Gilgal, beside, I don't know what that is, before Shechem. So near the city of Shechem, which is Mount Gerizim. So in the Samaritan Pentateuch, it actually names Mount Gerizim as the central place of worship where you should offer a sacrifice at the temple that was built there in the time of Nehemiah. Now, why did I talk all about that now? Because next week, we'll learn that temple was destroyed during the reign of John Hyrcanus, okay, who is the successor to Simon the Maccabee, Judas's brother, and then we'll go through the Hasmonean period to the time of Herod the Great. And we're out of time. So thank you so much, guys, for coming. I know it takes a lot of time, and to listen to my voice for that long, it's misery. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you.